I gather this is the first real spring day in Ghent. So for those of you who could stand to leave the sun and sit in a quite beautiful but dark theater, I'm glad that you came. I'm going to begin with a question you may well ask at the end. At least it's a question that I often am asked, more or less politely. How can you talk about moral idealism? Or even worse, write a book with a title like Moral Clarity. The words moral and clarity are suspicious enough, but both of them together? Isn't that an ideal that's impossible to achieve, and anyone who urges it dangerously arrogant? Does the woman actually think that she has it? Well, occasionally. And even when I'm convinced that I've achieved moral clarity in some question or another, it only happened after quite a lot of time, reflection, and analysis. Clarity is often confused with simplicity, both for those people who seek it and those who reject it. I understand the impulse to reject the entire notion, particularly since the expression comes, although actually not even that was original with him, from George W. Bush. If I take an expression for the first and I imagine last time from Bush, it's meant as provocation. Far too many people on the left, both in America and in Europe, were so repelled by the abuse of moral language by criminals like Bush that they decided to give up on moral language altogether. Now, I understand the impulse to resist such abuse, but it has unfortunate consequences. Namely, we abandon the strongest concepts we possess to the people who are least likely to use them properly. Now, it would be nice to write off the abuse of moral language as an American perversion, but as so often, what's happened in America is only an extreme form of development that's taking place all over the world. In the last few decades, anyone who wants to hear words like good, evil, honor, hero, even the word moral itself, has to look towards the right. I think it's probably only in Germany, though I'm not sure, that the word moral is actually used as a term of abuse. It is. Signaled by that ultimate postmodern gesture, the scare quote. I find it amazing that people are willing to look ridiculous, and it really does look ridiculous. We've all gotten used to this way of communicating. Willing to look ridiculous simply in order to say, well, I use a term like that, but I don't actually take it seriously because I know that seriousness, like other moral concepts, has become obsolete. A whole series of historical events have contributed to make us uncomfortable with moral language, most recently the events that took place in 1989, when it became clear even to the last defenders of state socialism that it was even worse than we'd feared. Censorship, arbitrary imprisonment, and terror were nothing new. What was devastating about the extent of communist crimes was the fact that they were committed in the name of principles many of us held dear. I just read an interview with Harry Belafonte this morning in Die Zeit, in which they asked him, among other questions, did you ever consider becoming a communist? And he said, didn't every intelligent person? Wow, you know, God bless Belafonte. You can't say things like that anymore. It may be, or very few people have the nerve to, it may be true, and I think it is, that the crimes of Stalinism no more undermine the ideals of socialism than the crimes of the Inquisition undermine the ideals of Christianity. But after all was said and argued, what was left was less a sense of skepticism about particular principles than about the prospect of acting on principle at all. Brave men and women had given their lives for ideals of freedom and equality, with results that can only bring us to tears today. If the Gulag was the result of acting on principle, wouldn't the world be better off if we sat on our hands? This conclusion is mistaken, but we have yet to think through the consequences of the collapse of communism, and we won't be able to do so unless we can think them through philosophically. Now you may wonder, of all the things in the world that need to be done in times like these, isn't philosophical reflection a luxury? Not if you think about words like idealism and realism, words that are used every day, but words that come from philosophy. Most philosophers are inclined to wince and groan when they hear the way politicians and journalists use them. But I think it's important to examine how much truth there is in the way that we ordinarily use them, and how many lies they are used to conceal. Consider what you mean when you tell someone, be realistic. A good translation would be, decrease your expectations. The world is going to disappoint you, so you may as well forget about trying to realize your ideals. They usually follow a few cliches about human nature and other things that can't be changed. Realistic is equivalent to resigned, which is equivalent to mature. Calling someone an idealist, on the other hand, has become equivalent to calling her a fool. And quite a lot of political and other arguments are won by calling your opponent idealistic without stopping to ask what it means. Now, I'm not going to give you a tour through the history of philosophy tonight, but I do want to spend a few minutes with Plato, because both the concept of idealism and the scorn for idealists begins in his masterpiece, The Republic, the first great book with which Western philosophy begins. That book opens with a group of men trying to find a definition of justice. One example they start with, justice is helping your friends and hurting your enemies. All right, Socrates answers, are we supposed to help our apparent friends or only our real ones, and do we know the difference? Should we help our real friends if they do something wrong? And why should we be intent on hurting our enemies when we know that even a dog becomes worse when you hurt it? So if we hurt our enemies, we're making our enemies actually worse. Now, there follows a rather hapless discussion until Thrasymachus enters the scene. That postmodern young man who is now about 2,500 years old. He makes fun of his elders for what he calls their naivete. Why go to the bother of trying to define justice? Don't they know that justice is simply the justice of the winners of history who preach a set of rules that are designed to keep them in power? Moral concepts are merely instruments of power that serve the self-interest of the stronger in exploiting the weaker. Anyone naive enough to take them seriously is no better than the sheep who believes that the shepherd does his work for the sheep's welfare and goes on believing it all the way to the slaughterhouse. These kinds of arguments should sound familiar to you even if you haven't read a word of Plato, because every generation seems to find it necessary to invent its own Thrasymachus, who suddenly discovers that moral concepts are often abused and therefore decides to give up on them entirely. You can call Thrasymachus Carl Schmitt, you can call him Michel Foucault, probably most of you have children in their 20s, I know I do, who sometimes sound like this. Every Thrasymachus, I actually can't see the audience because of the light, so I'm not sure what the ages are. I'm just guessing here. But if you don't have children who say things like this, I'm sure you have friends. Every Thrasymachus believes that he is being both brave and honest. The Republic is Plato's attempt to answer him. I don't think Plato's answer is sufficient. Kant's was much better. But what I want to concentrate on is the figure of Thrasymachus himself, because every new version of him is convinced that he is the first one to recognize the lies that we poor misguided sheep can't see. This insistence on demystification can occur in every political direction, as the example of Carl Schmitt shows, but what worries me most is the popularity of Thrasymachus on the left. The arguments he brings are always more historical than philosophical. In Western Europe, moral language was abused by the fascists as well as by the church, which did so little to oppose fascism. In Eastern Europe, the communist appeal to self-sacrifice on behalf of the common good served after '89 to make any such appeal seem faintly nauseating. Nor should we forget the way that the end of colonialism made clear how often simple greed and racism stood behind universalist rhetoric. But the roots of the left-wing distrust of moral language go deeper than recent history. They go all the way back to Marx himself. Not only the brutality of the practice of real existing socialism, but the incoherence of the theory threatens to turn us into cynics. I was told there's a, yeah. Now, Marxism's passion for truth and justice is just as real as Socrates' own. But Marxism's intellectual premises were a mixture of just those theses which Socrates opposed. Either justice means helping your class comrades and hurting your class enemies, or it's all just a matter of bourgeois ideology. Marxism's power was its claim to realize moral ideals that the Enlightenment had formulated but not thought through. This was originally not meant as a critique of the ideals themselves. Just to take one example, the Enlightenment insisted on the right to freedom of opinion in a day where all of the great Enlightenment classics were either censored, burned, published anonymously or other under names. This didn't seem like a trivial claim to make, but they didn't consider that the freedom of someone who can buy a printing press, today we'd have to say the Murdoch empire, is significantly greater than the freedom of someone who can do no more than stand on the street with a sign. Pointing this out was a powerful and progressive critique. But this critique was undermined by a metaphysical view that hadn't progressed since Thrasymachus. For Marxists, ideals are nothing but ideologies, rationalizations without real basis. Whether in philosophy, religion, or art, all have only one purpose: to conceal the real, that is, the economic powers that really make the world turn. Now, it didn't take long to see the paradox. Marx was a philosopher defending new ideas with passion and brilliance, along with a very old idea about the impotence of ideas at all. The history of Marxist theory is the history of attempts to resolve this paradox, beginning with Marx himself. But however often the details were reworked, what remained in people's minds was less theory than image. And images of base and superstructure remain, even for those who hardly think of themselves as Marxist. So the image, I think, that stays is that ideas are the foam, or the scum, that rise to the surface. But if you really want to quench your thirst, you better go for the drink underneath. Beer, I suppose. These are the kinds of metaphysical questions that actually determine our lives. Now, of course, the question, what is reality, has led to lots of pedantry, but your answer to that question has very real consequences. If you believe that reality only consists of experience, you have no basis with which to go beyond experience. If you believe, on the other hand, that ideas also have reality and power, you can use them to change experience. I've called Kant a grown-up idealist, and the subtitle of this book is quite different in English, actually. Who knows why? My publisher's representative is sitting here. But I don't know what the decision was. The subtitle in English is A Guide for Grown-Up Idealists. And I called Kant a grown-up idealist. He himself said that his theory of ideas was based on Plato's, cleaned up of the elements which can make Plato look like a fairy tale. There are many reasons to view Kant's work as a major source for progressive politics. He developed ideas of international law, a united nations, and even prefigured social democracy. But none of these ideas is as important as the idea of the idea itself. For without this basic metaphysics, no other idea has a chance. Every proposal for change can be met with a shake of conservative heads. You've certainly heard people say things like, well, freedom and equality are nice in theory, but the hard facts of experience have shown that it's utopian to expect them in practice. Perhaps you've even said them yourself. It's interesting to learn that claims like these were already cliched in 1793, when Kant wrote an essay called On the Old Cliché That May Be Right in Theory, but It Won't Work in Practice. In that essay, as elsewhere, he turns the claims of the so-called realists upside down. Of course the ideas of reason conflict with experience. That's what ideas are supposed to do. It's reason's job to ensure that experience does not have the last word, and it is reason that drives us to widen the horizons of our experience by providing ideas that experience should obey. If enough of us do so, it will. Now, I call this kind of idealism grown-up because it requires a great deal from us. Grown-up idealism requires that we recognize how much we are torn. The gap between the way the world is and the way the world should be is too great to ever disappear. I grant you this is a standpoint that guarantees a lifetime of dissatisfaction. It's much easier to give up on ideals altogether. If you believe that universal justice is a childish fantasy, you have no obligation to work for it. In this sense, realism is a form of resignation, and who hasn't been tempted to resign? So, the standpoint of Thrasymachus will probably always be with us. The rhetoric sounds brave and tough, but the practice is actually quite comfortable. This standpoint demands nothing but occasional criticism, which is why it's usually taken up by more or less educated people. But it's not the only way to avoid grown-up idealism. There's also a childish form of idealism, that is, holding on to ideas as the only genuine reality without attending to what the given world actually presents us. The tragedy of communism provides plenty of examples of that, but I want to turn briefly to a more recent threat. In the 10 years since September 11th, hundreds of empirical studies of would-be terrorists all point in the same direction. The most bitter opponents of Western civilization are not the ones who've been denied its fruits. On the contrary, they tend to be better educated and better off than most of their countrymen. They show no classic signs of psychological disturbance, nor are they driven by religious fairy tales. There's superb anthropologist named Scott Atran, who I highly recommend. He interviewed many leaders of jihadi groups, all of whom insisted, and he quotes one of them, "If someone came to me and said he wanted to become a martyr in order to get virgins in paradise, I would slam the door in his face." So the evidence not only cuts against the claim that terrorists believe in fairy tales, that they're nihilists, but it also cuts against any materialist explanations of their behavior. Fundamentalists, whether in Afghanistan or Arkansas, are not looking for the pie in the sky that will console them for their hunger on earth. They've been to the mall, and they want something that can't be found there. So, if not pure nihilism or false consciousness, what does move fundamentalists? A society that is unable to give children the sense that their life has meaning beyond collecting toys and gadgets will fail. If you're unable to give children the prospect that their lives can actually contribute to making the world make somewhat more sense than the way they found it, you'll hardly be able to get them up in the morning. It's a question of dignity. We want to determine the world, not merely be determined by it. We want to stand above the things we want to consume. We're born and we die as part of nature, but we feel most alive when we go beyond it. For to be human is to refuse to accept the given as given. Let me be perfectly clear, I'm not claiming that suicide bombers are Kantians, but paradoxical as it sounds, they are perverting a Kantian impulse. If we're going to provide alternatives to the temptations of fundamentalism and terrorism, we must understand why they're tempting. I've sketched this very, very briefly. I go into it more in the book because I want to focus on the question, how can we get from dogmatic, childish idealism to grown-up idealism? Don't ideals, you may ask, need foundations? Now, Religion is often seen as the foundation of all moral concepts, and it's seen that way by both believers and atheists. 2,000 years of religious war, sometimes fought by soldiers, sometimes fought by scholars, usually fought by both. Those wars should have convinced us by now that religion can't be the basis of morality. Even the Bible often denies that in fascinating texts I have no time to discuss today. For many people, religion remains a way to live out moral ideals, but it cannot ground them. This realization has often led philosophers to seek another metaphysical basis for morality, which is a long and often very boring story I don't want to examine tonight. What's interesting is our longing for commandments that determine morality, if not through religion, then perhaps through nature, as the attempts of many recent evolutionary psychologists show. These attempts reveal the wish to avoid the uncertainties that are present in moral reflection. Rather than looking for foundations, I prefer to speak of orientation. We can find orientation for moral concepts in the thought of the much maligned Enlightenment if we're prepared to look beyond its caricatures. Mention the Enlightenment these days and you are likely to get a sneer or a contemptuous response. But none of the postmodern critics of the Enlightenment offer anything in its stead. A defense of the Enlightenment is a defense of the modern world with all possibilities for self-criticism and transformation. I'd be the first to tell you that there's plenty in the modern world that deserves critique, but the possibilities for self-correction and change are missing in the two other alternatives, namely pre-modern nostalgia or postmodern skepticism. You can mourn the loss of the pre-modern world, you can yawn and accept the postmodern world, or you can defend and continue the modern. If somebody has a fourth possibility, I'd be happy to think about it, but I have asked around and I have yet to receive a suggestion for a fourth, which leaves me committed to defending the modern. Let me mention, before I do that, what the most common criticisms that are made of the Enlightenment, and I'm sure you've read them in many a magazine, even if you haven't read the philosophical, the longer philosophical versions of it. First of all, there's a claim: the Enlightenment believed that human beings are by nature good and endlessly getting better. Number two, the Enlightenment believed that reason is unlimited and can solve every problem and paid no attention to the role of emotion. Number three, the Enlightenment believed that nothing was sacred and profaned everything. And number four, the Enlightenment believed that progress was inevitable and ended in Auschwitz and Hiroshima. Now, these claims, which get repeated all over the world, are supported by no more than a few scraps of historical testimony, always torn out of context. And I'm not talking about nuance here. The Enlightenment is not only more subtle than the caricatures of that its critics propose, it was diametrically opposed to those claims. You needn't do any scholarship to figure this out. Forget about the archives and buy a paperback edition of Candide, the most read book of the Enlightenment, and you'll see that the most important attacks on the so-called Enlightenment came from the heart of the Enlightenment itself. Candide makes it clear that the Enlightenment opposed all the cliches that are attributed to it. It neither believed that human nature was benevolent, nor that progress was inevitable, nor that human reason was unlimited, nor that science is the answer to everything. Now, if the Enlightenment did not rest on such weak and silly principles, what did it believe? Tolerance and fairness are always mentioned as Enlightenment values, but I think it's important to focus on values which are more robust than these. Tolerance, in particular, is a negative value. You tolerate what you can't change. Okay? It may prevent some of our worst excesses, but it will not move anyone to action. So I want to concentrate on four modern values which are particularly important, and they are happiness, reason, reverence, and hope. The The Enlightenment demanded a right to happiness, which may strike you as banal until you think about how happiness was viewed in a pre-modern world. Before the Enlightenment, happiness was put in the past, in a mythical paradise which our ancestors lost through one sin or another, or in the future, in a heavenly paradise which we might, with grace, reach after our death. For the present, suffering was the order of the day. Sickness and poverty were the consequences of sin, some called it fate, and therefore a part of the cosmic order we have no right to judge. If you think we've completely overcome this view, by the way, you haven't read fundamentalist commentaries on recent natural disasters like the tsunami in the Pacific a few years ago or the earthquake in Haiti. These views are still around. Interestingly enough, they're in every religion. But to be committed to the Enlightenment means to reject the view that suffering and injustice are punishments. Rather, they're evils that can and should be addressed by human beings. Anyone who attempts to combat the injustices in the human world or the inadequacies in the natural one is acting on the assumption that all of us, however and wherever we were born, has the same right to happiness on earth. If you believe, by contrast, that life consists largely of suffering, you'll be unlikely to do anything but sigh. Happiness is a matter of right and not simply of luck. Our longing for happiness is neither a childish wish nor a weakness. Reason demands a balance between what you do in the world and what the world does to you. Now, of course, you can say sentences like this. Anyone who rapes and murders children should be rewarded with fame and fortune. Anyone who protects children should be slowly tortured to death, right? I mean, you can say them. The question is whether you can mean a sentence like that. I think they're rather like Descartes' claim in principle that 2 and 2 could be 5 if God chose to make it that way. It's very hard to understand. A world in which righteous people always suffered and wicked people always triumphed is a world that makes no sense. To be sure, there are days when the world looks quite close to that. That's why the claim that we have a right to happiness makes a demand on the present. If happiness is a human right in a world in which so many people suffer, it's the task of human beings to work towards it. Now, the Enlightenment conception of reason is just as active as its conception of happiness. The Enlightenment attacked the instrumental conception of reason conceived by classical rationalism, particularly in the person of someone like Leibniz, not only because that conception is not able to explain the world, but because it's neither free nor able to be an instrument of freedom. For that is reason's task. Contrary to what Romantic critics said, reason is not opposed to nature, it's opposed to authority. Enlightenment thinkers were well aware that reason has limits. They just weren't prepared to let the authorities be the one to set them. Everyone can think for themselves, and everyone can fail. Precisely because it's able to go beyond experience, reason is able to ask the question, this could have been different, so why is it like this? Reason's guiding principle is the principle of sufficient reason, not as the principle that everything in the world has a reason, but rather as a demand. Find the reason for the way things are now. Many things can count as reasons, but some things do not. Answers like, that's just how it is, or it was always that way, or they told me so. Those are not reasons. All kinds of things might be, but not that. Our ability to find reasons for what's given in the world is the basis both of scientific inquiry and social justice. So the personification of Enlightenment reason is not the rule-obsessed technocrat, but rather Mozart's Figaro, who uses his reason against the aristocracy, not against passion, but precisely in order to fulfill his own. Now, I've sketched somewhat different pictures of Enlightenment conceptions of happiness and reason than those which are normally painted, but no one will be surprised to hear them listed as Enlightenment values. If I mention reverence, people are surprised because reverence and enlightenment don't seem to fit together. Enlightenment thinkers never seemed so happy as when they were attacking traditional religion. Even today, the texts of Bayle or Voltaire on this subject are great fun to read, unlike the texts of Richard Dawkins, who takes himself to be their heir. Thus, both critics and defenders of enlightenment come easily to the conclusion that the attack on religion and anything in its neighborhood are the central goal of enlightenment. It is true that every thinker of the Enlightenment fought against fanaticism and superstition, particularly since they were the most important means of mystification, which allowed traditional governments to retain authority. They often still are, but they're not the only ones. But many Enlightenment thinkers attacked traditional religion on religious grounds. According to them, Orthodox religion was not only immoral, but blasphemy. Voltaire summed up this thought. He's quite wonderful. I quote, "May the great God who hears me, this God who is certainly neither born of a virgin nor died on a cross, who cannot be eaten in a wafer or drunk in a cup, may this God, the creator of all worlds, have mercy on the sect of Christians who profane him." End quote. You may ask why a modern view should hang on to any sort of religion at all, even one which has been purified of fanaticism and superstition. Now, I've said that the Enlightenment vision of reason is one which refuses to accept the given as given. Reverence, by contrast, is the moment when we are simply grateful for what's given. However, I understand the world to have been created, one thing is certain: it wasn't me that did it. However I understand the notion of God, one idea is contained in it, namely, human beings have limits. Reverence contains awe and, above all, gratitude for being itself and for the fact that we've been granted the chance to experience it. You may have reverence for God or for nature, but also for ideals of goodness, truth, and beauty, everything that finally is beyond our own reach. Reverence is the value which gives us balance. Kant put this best: two things fill the mind with awe and wonder the more often and more steadily we reflect on them: the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. One shows me my limits, the other shows me my freedom and power. Being grown up is a matter of staying aware of both. The last Enlightenment value, it's not the last, I mean, there may be many more, I'm concentrating on 4. The fourth Enlightenment value is hope, not to be confused with the optimism that was so clearly rejected in Candide. Optimism is a denial of facts. Hope is the attempt to change them. Neither Rousseau nor any other serious modern thinker ever claimed that human beings are essentially good, only that they're not born in original sin, either in the biblical or the Hobbesian version. Rousseau's observation that even animals feel compassion has been confirmed by modern scientific research. Not only apes and elephants demonstrate compassion and kindness. I saw a new study that claims that rats stop eating when they discover that their taking of food sends an electric shock to other rats. Proof that our capacities for compassion are fundamental and inborn have been recently offered by every field from child psychology to neurobiology. We have the tools to behave well. That we can behave badly hardly needs to be repeated. And that's the question that's more interesting than all the questions we cannot answer. If our capacity for goodness is as evident as our capacity for evil, why are we so interested in insisting on the latter? Pessimism is fashionable. Believe me, one gets treated very scornfully if you dare pointing out good news. I have to tell people, yes, I do know a little bit about the bad news. I actually wrote a book about evil before I wrote this book. So I'm not I haven't closed my eyes. It used to be conservatives who insisted on pointing out just how bad the human race is, and that was at least consistent with their own stated purposes, which involved rejecting any attempt to make things better, since the best one could hope for was to prevent things from getting worse. Today it's people who belong to what is sometimes called the progressive tradition who refuse to use the word progress, at least not without saying progress. That things we once thought would be progress turned out not to be progress is clear, but hardly an argument for the idea that progress is impossible. There is no such argument, and if you ask for one, you're likely to get the suggestion that the only alternative to believing that progress is impossible is believing that it's inevitable. This is not a philosophical argument. There are a few texts of Marx which suggest such a view, but no Enlightenment thinker ever thought that progress was necessary, only that it was possible. Why are we tempted to deny that? Well, one reason, I think, is that many committed atheists feel at home with one of the more disturbing elements of Christianity, namely the doctrine of original sin. Original sin in its many variations doesn't feel comfortable because Christianity invented it. Christianity cultivated it because it's a useful explanation for the problem of evil. The doctrine of original sin may give us responsibility, but it also gives us consolation, for it offers a reason for all the evils we experience. And humankind seems to be able to bear anything, including our own alleged guilt, better than sheer meaninglessness. So our inclination to believe the very worst about human nature has more of its roots in faith than in fact. Now, I don't have much use for original sin, and I don't come from a Christian tradition, which may make that easier. But I do keep noticing two pervasive character traits that seem fairly universal and fairly destructive. And those two are, we have really short memories, and we're very inclined to be ungrateful. Just think back half a century. The war of all against all, which Hobbes thought was natural, was taking place in what's now called the European Union. Seen with a little historical perspective, the European Union is a miracle, but say that anywhere in Europe and watch people roll their eyes. I don't know what it means to say it in Belgium, so it's probably worse than the rest of Europe, but I'm not sure. Recently, I read a German brochure which was trying to create enthusiasm for the EU with the question, what does Europe do for me? And then listed a catalog of self-interested advantages to be gained from the Union. Quite a number of politicians seem to view it in this light themselves, otherwise they wouldn't send the people they want to get out of the way to Brussels. To point to the fact that Europe is a miracle is not to refrain from criticizing the self-serving, gray, often self-destructive bureaucracy it's engendered, but without recognizing the achievement that Europe represents, will never be able to make a critique constructive, nor to realize its possibilities. Now, as I said, I like pointing to good news, not because I don't know the bad news, but because it's too common and easy to point it out. More importantly, I believe that if we cannot celebrate our successes, we will never be able to go on to make more. I could reel off a list of major instances of human progress in my lifetime alone. Few of them are unfamiliar, but all of them are things we're inclined to take for granted, and therefore be ungrateful for. But hope is a virtue, which means that it isn't a given. It's something one often has to work hard to retain. It has been hard to maintain a number of times during the last 3 years. When I wrote Moral Clarity, I was also very involved as a volunteer in the Obama campaign. The intervening 3 years have, if you want to look at it that way, presented plenty of evidence for the view that human nature is rotten, at least in parts of the United States. Greed, corruption, stupidity, a certain amount of racism, along with colossal ingratitude. I still believe that Obama is the best politician who ever offered himself up to clean up the worst mess the U.S. ever found itself in. And instead of thanking him for working so hard to stave off utter disaster, a majority, well, it's actually not a majority now, half the country has responded by blaming him for problems he never caused. Perhaps we'll just come to this in the discussion. So I don't need to be told that hope is hard. I've found it damned hard to maintain these past couple of years. And one of the things that keeps me going is the fact that there is no alternative. We can throw up our hands at the folly of humankind and go off to an island. I've been tempted. Or we can grit our teeth and reconsider our strategies for maintaining a world we can decently leave to our children. In reconsidering those strategies, we have to remember that however discouraging the last couple of years of the Obama presidency has been, and I speak as an American, but an American who's lived longer in Europe than anywhere in my adult life, and just as there was a surge of hope when the man was elected, there has been a surge of disappointment. I still have on my wall the front page of a Scottish newspaper that I picked up on the way back from election night when everybody was euphoric. And the Scots, I mean, are not your most emotive people. Exactly. And the front page just says, has a picture of Obama. It says, "All things are possible." And we all felt that way. We've all come to think differently. But I urge us to remember that 4 years ago, when I began the election that people are now discouraged by, looked entirely impossible. I was assured by almost everyone I knew that America would never elect a black man or would assassinate him before he took office. Now, in order to realize any of the promise of this presidency, we have to recall how miraculous it seemed to all the world. And indeed, the current right-wing reaction in the U.S. should remind us of what a miracle it was. I grew up in the Deep South during the Civil Rights Movement and can vividly remember when it was illegal for me to swim in the same lake where black children swam. But however it may have been simpler to be hopeful in those days, none of us even began to hope that a black man would make it to the White House. It seemed so utterly unrealistic that it wasn't even a possibility we dismissed. It didn't even occur to anyone. Now, the point of pointing to signs of progress is not to let us rest on our laurels, but to give us the courage to do more. It's easy to count off signs of decline. Why do we enjoy it? Well, among other things, it's a form of self-protection. Idealists will spend their whole lives struggling with disappointment, while pessimists can only be pleasantly surprised. Those so-called realists may claim to be tough, their position is far more comfortable. The rest of us are walking a tightrope all the time. Let me conclude with a remark about style. When I observe discussions in which educated people are embarrassed to talk about ideals or progress, the first thing I notice is their fear. This is not fear of abusing or simplifying such concepts, because I'm talking about educated people who claim, of course, that what their fear is that other people will simplify them. I think the real fear is much more primitive, and it's fear of embarrassment. Using words like progress or idealistic without the protection of scare quotes can make people laugh at you. I think the fear of embarrassment should actually be the real embarrassment, particularly since it's most frequently found in adolescents who dread nothing more than being seen by their friends as lacking in cool. In every discussion about literature or film or which declares a happy ending to be kitsch, in every political discussion which refuses to take any motives but economic ones seriously, Thrasimica's ghost is alive. It's a spirit of fear, but also of disappointment, like a young man who's been betrayed by his lover and decides in the future he's only going to visit brothels and give up on looking for love entirely. Of course, declarations of love can be false, like declarations of moral intention. Everything that can really be used can also be abused, which is one of the things you learn in growing up. But to give up our most powerful concepts because they're liable to abuse is to impoverish your world immeasurably. For without the language of morality, we are in no position even to describe the world, and certainly not to change it. Thank you.
Right. So I think these microphones work. Thank you very much, Susan. I should say from the start that, as I told you before, that I found both you, I found your book and then also, unsurprising, your lecture very congenial, because if only with the English subtitle, a guide for grown-up idealists, I thought, that's exactly me, I thought. Well, without the scare quotes around idealist, but perhaps with something like that around grown-up, because, you know, one of the things I'm going to do tonight, or the main thing is, I can't resist it, is to play the devil's advocate. And perhaps that's one of the ways in which I remain a bit childish and I allow myself to be that. So before doing that, though, I think it would be interesting for the audience if you said a bit more about your trajectory, because you, as you hinted at it in your talk, you oscillated, as it were, a little bit between 3 continents at various stages in your life, and for reasons that are not unrelated to the disappointments, sometimes the hopes you had as perhaps not a grown-up idealist, but an idealist that was gradually growing up through the various experiences you had. So if I understood also your dedication to your mother at the end of the book, you first lived in Atlanta, in Georgia. And if you could say a bit for the audience then what made you change continents a number of times, briefly.
It could go on for a long time, but let me try and give a very short version. I was born in Atlanta and spent the first 13 years of my life there, and I owe that to experience 2 things. We were not typical Southerners. Most people think I come from the west side of New York City. Who knows anything about American geography? And so I think I got used to being an outsider. My parents were Jews from the north, and we were outsiders. But as I said, and that's why I dedicated the book to her, and fortunately she lived long enough just to see it, and not really to read it, but to see it. My mother was involved in the civil rights movement, and that was a big part of my life. Certainly, it was one of the great moments in American, or perhaps international history, that you saw the world literally change before one's eyes as a child. Not just, I mean, here it's often Martin Luther King who's known, but there were thousands and thousands of less prominent, more ordinary people who were simply committed to particular universalist ideas and changed history.
And so when you were 13, then you left the South?
Yes. A long story. I mean, I then got involved at a appallingly early age in the rest of the movement, working against the war in Vietnam. Not that I or any of us really did any good on that score, but there was a movement. I discovered philosophy somewhere on the road outside of school and decided that was what I wanted to do with my life. Then after having quite wonderful education with some people that we both know in common, I went to Berlin for a year thinking that would be it and I would go back and to be a standard academic philosopher. And I began to feel that what I cared about in philosophy was not so clearly being doable in academic philosophy. And I felt, yes, I had learned a lot of philosophy, but there was an awful lot that I didn't know about the world and about history. And Berlin was a fascinating place to learn more of it. And I also care about other forms of writing, too, than writing philosophy. So I was there for 7 years. I went back to, I taught at Yale for a while, where I also
So you left Berlin shortly before the Berlin Wall
exactly
fell.
The wrong time, yes.
You thought it would stay there forever. So
everybody thought it would stay there forever, yes.
So you went back to the States and
correct.
Then Yale.
Taught philosophy at Yale. Felt that I had been de-Americanized in certain ways, but also that I didn't. We were talking just a bit about how little possibilities American culture has. Europe is quite different on this score for serious philosophers or serious intellectuals to really play a role in the public world. It's a bubble. It's a beautiful bubble, but it's a bubble. And I went to Israel for 5 years. This was just after the Oslo Accords were signed, and things looked much more hopeful there. So I lived
you taught at Tel Aviv University?
Correct, correct.
And then
yeah, and then I was offered,
again?
yes, and then in the year 2000 I was offered a job that really seemed made for me, and I do believe that it is. I was offered a job as director of the Einstein Forum, which, if I understand things correctly, though I'm not sure that I do, it's a bit like doing something like this festival all year. Mm-hmm. Fortunately, not as much, because it does leave me time to write my own work, but we're an interdisciplinary, international think tank that has one foot in very serious intellectual work and another one in the public sphere. So that's where I am.
Then you briefly alluded to the fact that when you went to Harvard as a student, and then you were a teaching assistant, and you said we had some common acquaintances, because as it happened, Susan worked as a teaching assistant for John Rawls for a course called Philosophy 171, Political Philosophy, which I taught in my Harvard periods a number of years later. Now, Susan mentions Rawls in her book in a way that has been interpreted by some as an attack on Rawls. I think it's really quite mild, but it is nevertheless critical. And essentially, it's also partly a criticism through Rawls as being this extraordinary person also in terms of human personality. It's also a critique of the lack of involvement of the American academics in general, even the very best ones, in a way the most morally committed ones like Rawls, who didn't want to intervene in public affairs in a very explicit way, in a very public way. So if you could express a bit better your frustration about that. So,
well, as you rightly said, he was a terrible speaker. He had a stutter, and actually, as a student in 171, in order to stay awake during his lectures, you had to sort of learn systems of taking very good notes or something. I mean, so you can say the man was not made, perhaps, for public intervention, but it's more about the culture. And I put it this way: I am not so much of an idealist, or in that way I'm a grown-up idealist. I have one eye on the material world. It's not so much that I believe that all of my very fine, committed, thoughtful, serious, reflective friends who roughly share my political views in the States, that if suddenly they had a voice, we would be loud enough to drown out the power and money of Fox television. On the other hand, it does seem to me that the relative sanity, I'm not over-idealizing this, but the relative sanity of certain European cultures has to do with the fact that you have serious public discussion. You have it in the radio, you have it in the television, it's state-funded, you have festivals like this all over Europe. We can all complain that there should be more, that it should be better, and of course there are, you know, boulevard, what do they call them in English? crummy newspapers. What are they called?
Tabloids.
Tabloids. Thank you. Thank you. You know, in all of these countries too, but you do not have a public. I mean, gosh, I would say that my secretary at the Einstein Forum is way better, who never went to university, is way better informed about the world than a huge number of educated people in the United States. You don't have movements of people denying evolution or climate change. Now, those things, this is not sheer stupidity. One should know that the third richest family in the US has put a gigantic amount of money into denying climate change. They own a big chunk of the oil business. I mean, this is not mysterious, okay? But nevertheless, where you live in a culture where money is able to buy so much of public opinion, and you know, it's complicated. It has to do with state-supported media versus private media. This is one of the issues, but I believe that one has to focus on the things that one can control oneself. And they're very, I mean, this is still, I don't know what it's like here. You even come across this in Germany on occasion, that people will think it's not serious to write for, you know, the newspapers, or to, es ist nicht wissenschaftlich, es ist feuilletonistisch, you know. So you do get that kind of view even in Europe, but certainly much less so, I think, than in American academies.
Let's now move.
You still haven't played devil's advocate yet. I'm waiting for
No, this is coming now. So, and let's come then to I mean, your central message. So you defend idealism by saying it doesn't need to be naive, it doesn't need to be childish. And you have two sets of adversaries. And so there may be some overlap between them, but they are not quite the same. There are the cynics and there are the fatalists, right? Now, the cynics say, well, you know, all this idealism, it's fake, it's just hiding interests, and so on. So when you are faced with them, what do you find the strongest argument against them? So what is it? Because you may be referring to progress. You touch on that in your lecture. So enlightenment, enlightenment people like you are not claiming that progress is inevitable, but they want to say that it's not impossible. And as you said, it's possible to point out a number of cases in which what you call our successors, and it's important to be able to stress these successors, Obama having been elected, whatever he did afterwards, or the miracle of the European Union, however great the bureaucrats may be. And so it's important. But will that convince a cynic? Because a cynic will say, well, there may be things like that happening, but they are really driven by sheer self-interest of the people, and you as an idealist thinking they are moved by value, you are just under an illusion. What can you reply to them? Well, what do you reply to them?
I mean, look, it's a conversation I sometimes have with my son, actually, you know, so it's not, it's an ongoing project.
Well, probably grown-up idealism, it's not necessarily genetically transmissible. So you may have engendered a cynic.
No, that's the interesting thing. Shouldn't talk about it. You know, I think people of my son, many people my son's generation, he's 26, are extraordinarily aware of the way in which the power of capitalism, or the role that the power of capitalism had in taking over a number of the ideals that you and I grew up fighting for. I think they are working on, some of them anyway, working on ways of overcoming that. You know, the first thing that I do, by the way, when I run through this argument, perhaps I've been through iterations of this already at the dinner table. But first of all, pointing out that Foucault didn't discover this argument, Schmitt didn't discover this argument, it's been around since Thrasymachus, because that is the most striking thing about these conversations, is that people are usually believe that they have discovered this point. And that does give people some pause, I think.
Yeah, but surely it's not enough. They'll say it's old, but it's still true.
No, it's not. It's not enough, because I think once you make a, it's a bit like the argument about relativism with which it's connected. You can say a lot of things. You can make a lot of general claims. Then if you start pointing to particular instances, was that action, pure self-interest, or was it, do you see that people are sometimes moved by moral ideas? I mean, there's some people who never drop their guns. I had a huge argument with Steven Pinker about 1.5 years ago at a conference at Harvard, who, absolutely had this convoluted explanation for why we admire certain heroic actions. Okay, he's made a living off of it, a very good living. He's at a certain point you're not going to get someone like that to change their mind. But I think most other people, once you start asking, so who do you admire? Is there anybody you admire? It will turn out just like such people will say, oh, there's no morality and it's all culturally relative and whatever. Well, take this one bit of behavior. Do you think, and it could be something like, child sacrifice, which they used to practice all the time. You really think it doesn't? And usually there's a great deal of agreement on particular cases that there isn't in the abstract. Another example that I've been using lately, and it's so bizarre because people seem to have forgotten entirely about this. We now have gay marriage, even in many states in the United States, not to mention much of Europe, okay? I remember a time when there was a draft on for the Vietnam War, and there were a couple of ways to get out of going to the draft, because Obama just finally, 40 years later, overturned the prohibition on gay people serving in the army. All you had to do was walk into your draft board with sort of exaggerated fake gay gestures, and you were out, okay? I don't know a single person who did that. They went to Canada, they went to jail, they went to Vietnam, rather than, and these are, left-wing guys, rather than endure the suspicion that maybe actually if they could do that, they were gay after all. So we have seen a sea change in a couple of decades in ways that go very, very deep and that are based on no particular economic interest that I can see. Anyway, so you come up with examples.
There is progress. We have our little equivalent here also despite what could have been expected a few months ago, a few years ago, we now have a prime minister who is not only of immigrant origin, not only belongs to the Walloon minority in this country, unlike most of the people in this room, but in addition is overtly homosexual. So what do you think about that?
We have a mayor in Berlin.
Yeah.
And
okay.
it's
maybe there's even
actually we now have a foreign minister, but he's the worst foreign minister, probably the worst foreign minister we ever had. But well, in any case,
all good things don't necessarily go together.
No,
right?
No. Again, these are the kinds of changes that have happened so quickly. It's actually taken quite a lot of time and a lot of cultural stuff and a lot of groundwork has been made, but these are the kinds of things that people are, again, I talked a little bit at the end about our capacity to be ungrateful. I think it's gigantic.
Yeah. Now, with the fatalists, there is, I mean, they have somewhat sort of different profile. In fact, I like many of the formulas you use. Some of them made me think of a sentence which often comes back to my mind, which may be familiar to some of you. There is this French novelist called André Gide, 20th century, has this beautiful sentence in Les Nourritures Terrestres, which is, cesse de croire. He's talking to Nathanael, who is the young man in Les Nourritures Terrestres, and he says, cesse de croire si tu l'as jamais cru.
I'm sorry, well, my French is
no,
really
I'll
bad.
Translate.
Okay.
I'll translate. It's not very long, but most of the people in the room will understand. So, cesse de croire si tu l'as jamais cru que la sagesse est dans la résignation. Stop thinking, if you ever thought so, that wisdom lies or resides in resignation. So it's a beautiful. But Gide said that in the middle of the 20th century. Wrote that in the early 20th century. But in some dimensions of life, especially the more economic dimensions of life, and that's what I thought you were going to mention when talking about the reaction of your son, there's the feeling that we are more powerless than ever. That is, there's a sort of dilemma between trying to act at a local level, at the level of a small political unit, a small country, a small region. You can do something, but what can that entity do in the big world? Because there are the law, the rating agencies, and the pressures of the world market, etc. And you can't do much. You can influence what is being decided, but what is being you can hardly decide anything at that level because everything comes from higher up. And when you try to take decisions on a higher level, at the European level, 500 million people, or at a high level, then it's so remote from where you are that you feel powerless again. And so, isn't there for many of the things, the indignados in the street, or Occupy Wall Street, Occupy whatever, Ghent, isn't there also a feeling that, you can voice your discontent, your frustration, your indignation, but then you are powerless in changing something that comes to you. So what do you reply to these guys?
Look, it's a very serious question. And if you had asked me half a year ago, I might have been grimmer. Well, no, half a year ago, there was already the Arab Spring, which for all of the disappointments that have been associated with that, it's been quite extraordinary. It's been extraordinary to see how it's influenced the Russians. Yes, the guy was re-elected, although my Russian assistant said elected. It's okay, I forgave him in that particular instance. Putin is around the people that he's been reconfirmed in his job. The people who I have spoken to know quite a bit about what's going on in Russia, think he will not serve out his term and that his time is short. So you've actually seen, through the internet, you've seen this very large movement and the Occupy movement. You see, I think the Occupy movement is incredibly important. It has changed the conversation of the US election. I think, we don't know how it's going to turn out, of course. I hesitate to make any prophecies. It makes me too nervous. But at the moment, things look very good for Obama. And I think the Occupy movement had a huge impact on the discussion in the Republican primaries.
Mm-hmm. In what way?
Romney is doing terribly. Romney, who's put millions, the only reason Romney is still doing well at all is that he's just got so much money to spend. But the way in which Occupy focused its conversation, focused a national conversation that has been taking place at an electoral level is extraordinary. I never saw anything happen that fast. And the way that people are focusing right now on issues of social justice. Now, this is not to say that even in a second term, Obama won't be beholden to Wall Street. Of course he will be. But that movement, which doesn't really show any signs of evaporating, I mean, it's winter, and so people aren't sitting in parks at the moment, is actually, I think, a sign of the opposite. I think it's a sign of hope.
Of course, with all the ambiguities of the movement and difficulty to produce anything like a specific proposal, I was struck, for example, when the indignados that had come from Spain came to camp in my neighborhood. I saw just 20 meters from each other, one protesting against austerity and the other one defending soberness, so sort of a voluntary soberness. I don't know how you, what simplicité volontaire, so where you. And so obviously there is a tension between the two things, and a difficulty for such a movement to, and so it's not because, it's certainly been a very powerful movement also because of its worldwide or very widespread nature to express discontent and indignation. And it may have changed the sort of affected public opinion and therefore political feasibility, but it's still not having a grip on situation.
How, I mean, once again, having brought up these couple of examples, I mean, we didn't even talk about how much has changed between men and women in our lifetimes for the better, despite the fact that there's still sexism in some places of the world. It's still deadly. So we're talking about very sweeping changes that you and I have seen in our lifetime. How impatient are you? I mean, that is, we've just got again. I also some of the remarks I made at the beginning, and some of the things that I'm really quite worried about, the anti-communist backlash, very, very strong in Germany in particular, which I think is a result of not having come to terms with the consequences of '89, so that we all internationally seem to have been given a narrative that says, well, any attempt at socialism is going to wind up totalitarian, so we'd better stick with capitalism, however grotesque it is. This has only been 20 years, okay, where we were all shocked. Now, again, we're having a global conversation about the distribution of wealth and economic inequality as the burning issue. Give it a little time.
By the way, on this, to return to Philosophy 171, in fact, I attended only once a lecture given by Rawls when he was still giving this political philosophy course, and that was in the spring of 1990. And I had gone to Harvard to give a lecture, and I asked Rawls whether I could, well, for those less familiar, so John Rawls is someone who is really at the basis of contemporary political philosophy, first in the US and then much more broadly because of a book he published in 1971 under the title A Theory of Justice. And so I asked him whether I could attend this lecture, but in typical Rawls, he said, "Oh no, I don't want you to. You know more than I do about this thing." Amartya Sen, who was standing next to him, said, "Come on, this guy is coming all the way from Belgium. Jack, let him listen to you." So then he said, "Okay, but I'm going to talk about Marxism today," and that was, I found, quite moving in a way, because we were then in the spring of 1990, so shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and you had this respected, prestigious American professor, one of the most prestigious institutions of the world, trying to convince his audience, part of the future US elite, of the importance of taking Marxism seriously, whatever had just happened in Eastern Europe generally, and whatever the historical fate of the socialist regimes. And well, I mean, that was. Let me then ask, and then we'll turn to the room. A couple more questions. One, you alluded to that European Union. So if you've been living in it for quite a while, in your book, you emphasize the fact that, in fact, it's part of the identity of the United States of America to be committed to some values. And so even in, I mean, whether sometimes hypocritical or not, but in declarations about foreign policy, but also, I mean, some beautiful speeches, including by Obama before his election, or Kennedy's famous speech, etc. You have this commitment to values that boosts the American spirit and that gives them a pride in their nation and the values they defend. That is at the core of US patriotism as well. Is there anything like that possible at the level of the European Union? Should there be something similar for the European Union? Is
Absolutely. And I really do think, and I made a little reference to it in the end, yeah. I think Europe would be way better off if it were possible for people to talk about Europe as a source of inspiration rather than what benefits do I get out of Europe. I mean, as it were, not ask what Europe can do for you, but ask what you can do for Europe.
Sounds very American.
Look, you know, my ideal person or voter or whatever would be a combination of European and American values. There are differences. I mean, the funny thing is that I think Europe has managed to actually realize more ideals, and certainly more Enlightenment ideals, than the US has done. No question about it. But it's like, you know, America has the music and a certain kind of, I mean, not in the literal sense, in a certain kind of spirit that when there is an ideal, like the ideal of the civil rights movement or the Obama campaign, which in many ways was connected with it, they're able to, I mean, I'm sort of halfway in between at this stage of my life, move people in ways that are extremely important. You see, I agree with you that it's hard to imagine how it would actually happen, but I think it would be doable. And I think it has to do with understanding the idea of Europe and the European Union as a creation of the Enlightenment, and being able to be tied and committed to certain principles, both as a European and in particular European cultures. I have to say, I've barely been in Belgium, so I don't know enough about Belgian history or contemporary politics. One reads a little bit. But I'm fairly often in Holland. The last time I was in Holland, I was asked to talk about, and of course the people that would invite me anyway are very worried about Wilders, and that his appeal to a kind of nationalism rather than internationalism and anti-European, and the question was, what could they do? And my answer was, look, Dutch culture has enormous treasures that one could appeal to as national treasures if you went about it in the right way. And I don't just mean Spinoza, and I don't just mean a tradition of being a refuge. Take something like the great age of Dutch painting. It was the first time that ordinary people were invested with the kind of luminousness and beauty that used to be saved for Greek heroes or biblical figures. It's a hugely democratic tradition, okay? Now, I don't mean to say that all of Holland consists of, you know, Spinoza and Vermeer. I know it doesn't, you know. But I do believe that people, in order to create ideals or hang on to ideals, I believe that they need to have examples that are culture specific, and that there are enough of them if one were willing to be proud of Europe. You see, this is where I think the left is, nothing was such a terrible term of abuse as the word Eurocentric. And I think most left-leaning Europeans, certainly the ones that I know, are terribly afraid of that. At the same time, I think those people have done brilliantly in actually not being Eurocentric. One knows about all the European programs that are both giving back to other parts of the world and learning from other parts of the world. I mean, you certainly experience more of that in most countries in Europe than you do in the US, for example, which just barely knows that there are other continents. But it's as if in the worry to not be Eurocentric and to appreciate other cultures, people are terrified of defending the idea of Europe or any European ideals. And I think that's been a real loss. Okay,
so they should try to do European patriotism around European values. May not be an easy job. Huh?
I didn't say it was easy, but around Enlightenment values.
Final question about death. So it often occurs to me that when I'm spending a lot of time on sort of try to further a particular cause, that or even writing some books that might contribute to some causes, that in fact if this is ever going to have any impact, may not have any, but if it is ever going to have any impact, it's likely to be after I'll be gone, right? In fact, I think about that also in connection of one of my heroes before Rawls, John Stuart Mill. He had these books, first beautifully written, middle of the 19th century, where he was defending crazy ideas. I mean, things like proportional representation, or worse still, voting rights for women. All these people thought this man is completely crazy. And of course, he died long before any place in the world introduced the first voting rights for women and so on. So my question to you is this, is it worth bothering if for people like you, I suspect, though in your book it's suggested, by not being fully clear, but people like me who don't believe in life after death. So why bother doing all these things that will only happen, if they ever happen, after we'll be gone?
I have to say, I have trouble understanding that question. And I have trouble understanding it because, first of all, I mean, one never knows when one's going to die. It could be, God forbid, tomorrow, and it could be,
tonight.
The idea of planning one's life based on one's death seems problematic to begin with. I mean, you might say, I know because we discussed we both have children, isn't it like saying, why have children? Because by the time you actually know what's going to become of them, you won't be around anymore. I mean, look, I think life gets meaning now from our, first of all, pursuing projects that have a purpose, that put me, I don't think life has meaning, I think we make meaning, and we make meaning by acting in the world. And without that, I think most of us feel that our lives are fairly senseless. I mean, you say, why bother? Because, well, what else would I do? I mean, yes, I like to eat, drink, be merry, listen to music, dance, all that stuff, but I think, like most people, perhaps even a little more than most people, but I actually think people have this in common. One wants to give something back to the world for the gift of being alive in it. And I think without that, lives are pretty impoverished.
Okay, thank you. So we'll try to continue trying to make the world better, unless some of the people in the room convinced that this is not a good idea. So it's time now for you to ask questions. So I think...
I can't see anything. Is there any way of turning this light down a little so we can see the audience?
Enlightenment.
Thank you.
So, yeah. So I think there's a traveling microphone, or there's someone with a microphone. Yes. Coming. Yes. There's a microphone coming, so it's better for you to wait for it.
No, actually, now that I can see, very few people here have children, or at least grown children. Only the few people in the front row.
All right. Yes.
Thank you. Professor Neiman, you gave a fast and remarkable overview of the history of philosophy, starting with Socrates and ending with Rawls. Now, you cannot expect from me or from anybody in the public to repeat that study of philosophy before we can take decisions. I propose there is a more easy way, everyday way, to reach grown-up idealism, where we do not need the study of all those philosophers. And I will, of course, very briefly try to explain this, but you will, of course, recognize it. It starts by our choice, what kind of life, what kind of world we want for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren, for our family, for our friends, for all those we think are important in the world, for nature. But of course, before we take then decisions and make our choice, we have to examine the consequences, all the consequences, by studying the scientific facts. And you gave the example of the climate change. We, of course, have not to believe what the papers write, but we have to study the scientific facts. And that holds for every other important decision that we take. And of course, we can still make a choice, for example, of a world where only the elite is important, as by the lady and the Alissa Rosenbaum, who changed her name, the neoliberalism utopia. You can make that kind of choice. But then, of course, the question immediately is, will I and my children belong to the elite? And then you have to reflect longer what the consequences
So
will be.
your question is?
Well, do you think that this is a rational way where, of course, our emotional choices are very important? And can we arrive then at a grown-up idealism?
Look.
So is there a shortcut?
I would be ridiculous if I said you have to study philosophy in order to act decently in the world. Of course you don't. There are very, very many people who've done so without it. But, and by the way, I was not trying to summarize the history of philosophy. I was only trying, which is bad enough, to summarize in 20 pages a 450-page book or so. I have tried to write a book that can be read, no, I won't even say tried, because I know it is read by an awful lot of people with no background in philosophy, precisely because I believe, not by spending all the years that I spent doing philosophy, but doing some philosophy helps people to think critically, helps them to avoid making mistakes like thinking they've invented the wheel when they're actually just simply parroting Thrasymachus, and that's why I went into that, and helps them to withstand the kinds of criticism that they will get in the world. So, of course, there are shortcuts. You don't. I mean, I hope you don't spend as much time as I spent my life as an academic philosopher, actually. But I think there are things of great beauty and wisdom to be learned, not simply from philosophy, from great literature as well, that you are, well, certainly you're just missing out as a human being if you don't spend some of your life reading Tolstoy. I mean, I'll swear to that. You know, your experience of the world and your likelihood of being wise about human beings in it will be severely impoverished. I'm just rereading War and Peace at the moment. If you don't do that. Mutatis mutandis for some other examples. So when I urge people to read philosophy, I don't mean it in any kind of simple disciplinary sense. It encompasses a whole range of things that embody wisdom. I mean, if I understand your question correctly, I don't understand why one would want to do without it. I completely agree that a lot of our decisions are as, you know, have to do with emotion, but I don't see reason and emotion as being opposites. I think they work best when they work together. And
okay, is there another question? Yes. Well, yes. Back. Who else, so that I can already see the inspiration will come? Yes.
Yes. The question is in a small way related to the former question. And it's, you gave a defense of the Enlightenment, but the defense of the Enlightenment is also a reconstruction of the Enlightenment, because the Enlightenment has many ways you can go to and many traditions that are harbored in it. And one of the traditions, one of the reconstructions of Enlightenment in this age is the equation of science with knowledge, of science with enlightenment. There's two versions of this one. First, philosophy is obsolete, only science matters. And second, one that I find a lot more important is, in order to strive towards enlightenment, it is necessary to strive towards science, which is the standpoint that you can hear, for instance, in the new atheistic debate, which claims the mantle of enlightenment. On the other hand, you have a tradition in the Enlightenment itself, perhaps best exemplified by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his letter on arts and sciences, who claims that arts and sciences really aren't good to be enlightened, quite the opposite. So I was wondering, when we think about how can I strive towards an enlightened and compassionate life, is it necessary to strive towards sciences and arts, or is it something that is good, but that it is not necessary?
Perhaps to add a little bit of context to this, in the Belgian context, we had, for a long time in this country, there was only one university, which was of Christian origin. Then we had the creation of university by in the Dutch period, so in the 1820s, of two state universities here in Ghent and in Liège. And then there was, shortly afterwards, in 1834, the creation of something called the Université Libre de Belgique, initially, which took as its motto, which is was seen as a very Enlightenment motto, which is still its motto now, which was Scientia vincere tenebras. And so that means science. So science must, it's the infinitive, but must overcome the tenebras, the darkness. So yeah, that would be darkness. Now, the darkness, that was us, that is, I'm at Louvain University, so that was the prime target, but it was more generally anything that had to do, that was outside science, and so it could be the arts. It was, of course, primarily religion, and you mentioned something about the ambivalent relationship to religion among some of the Enlightenment authors. But of course, there was a significant atheistic component in it, hence the suggestion that your reading of the Enlightenment is, of course, one interpretation of the message of the Enlightenment, in which, as you recognize, there were many currents. So, in your reconstruction of the Enlightenment, how much room must be left, in your view, for these other dimensions that have been mentioned, including the religious one?
This is, how much time do I have? Look,
5 minutes for this question, so that we can take.
Well, the truth is that this question really allows me to answer the first gentleman's question, because although I sometimes myself have asked myself, did I need to spend so many years of my life doing professional philosophy? When I hear a question like this, I realize, boy, you know, even if it's not your field, I don't know what you're studying or
what?
I'm studying philosophy.
You are studying philosophy, okay. But you're still studying. And you got to do a little more, because I know these texts very, very well. I love the first discourse. I've taught it a whole bunch of times. It's a great essay. I mean, there's no question. I think it's actually as relevant today in many ways about the culture industry as it was
so that's Rousseau.
Rousseau, yeah. As it was when it was written. However, if you look at Rousseau as a whole and look at what he said, you can also read, I think one must read, the Emile as his answer to both the first and second discourses, okay? So Rousseau went through development. By the way, I, along with Immanuel Kant and Ernst Cassirer, I mean, there's a tradition of people, neo-Kantians, who look at Rousseau as part of the Enlightenment. There's another tradition that considers him a romantic. I think it's a very, very superficial view of Rousseau and a superficial view of the Enlightenment.
The romantic interpretation.
Yeah. I mean, it's a view that assumes that if you care about reason, you can't care about emotions, for example, or that if you care about nature, you can't care about, you know. And it's just, it was neither Rousseau's view, nor was it Voltaire's, nor was it Diderot's, nor was it Kant's. You know, it is, there are, I put it this way, I don't claim to have the absolutely only view of the Enlightenment, but I have written a thick book on it, and I have read what an awful lot of people think about it, including all the original texts, and there's so much nonsense written about the Enlightenment that will get into the newspapers or, you know, this or that course, even among fairly educated people, that it's nice to be able to have the tools to respond. One way to respond to your question about the first discourse is with a quote from Emile, in which he of course delays Emile's education, and he doesn't want him to learn things by rote and so on, but he says if he ever comes to write books, it will be to change, to support the rights of humankind. Now, interestingly enough, the only autobiographical quote we have from Immanuel Kant about what he was doing is he wanted to, he would consider himself as of less use than a common laborer if he wasn't writing books in order to defend the rights of humankind. That's the quote in which he said Rousseau changed his life. So there are ways to answer your question. Every reading isn't arbitrary. There are better and worse readings. But one needs to read quite a bit in order to figure out what they are. As for the view about science, it's amazing that people who talk about that never ask what the word science meant in the 18th century. Here's a question for you. You may know that, of course, Newton was every 18th century person's idol, and everyone wanted to be the Newton of the mind, okay? Now, David Hume, for example, wrote of wanting to be the Newton of the mind. So you might think that means, okay, it's about reductionism and materialism, and that's not how they saw it. It was Kant who declared Rousseau to be the Newton of the mind. Now, Rousseau was hardly a scientist in a sense that would be recognized today. I mean, to put it mildly, except for a little book he wrote on botany, all right? But the lines between science, philosophy, all kinds of explorations were not anything like what they are today. In fact, David Hume, this is a little interesting fact, when he wrote once a piece about how he thought politics should become more scientific. It should be put on a scientific footing. So who did he have in mind? Was it Montesquieu? Was it Grotius? It was Alexander Pope. Okay? So I mean, who
was a poet?
Who was a poet, yeah, who was a poet. So when the Enlightenment talks about science, they don't mean, and being able to further it, they don't mean any of the kinds of things that we would mean by it today. And that's just something that one needs to know before one accuses them of being scientistic or saying that the only hope is technology. That's not what they were saying.
Okay, are you satisfied by this answer?
Well, so if I understand you correctly, when people like Dawkins are reinterpreting the Enlightenment to align themselves with it, they are wrong. Am I?
Yeah, the short version is this. Look, and again, I did write I wrote quite a bit about this in the book. Look, once again, if you look at Dawkins, Hitchens, Dennett, there's a fourth one, Sam Harris, the so-called new atheists. There's nothing, but nothing in any of them that wasn't said much better in the 18th century, okay? I mean, talk about inventing the wheel. And what I find most disturbing about all of them is in their scorn, and it's real scorn. I mean, I think Dawkins has even written something, people who believe in God are like people who believe in fairies or something. In their scorn for religion, they have completely ignored the fact that they're very serious, not only that all this was said 200 years ago, but that they're very smart people who came up with things to say back to them. And by scorning and neglecting the better religious impulses, or the better impulses that lead to religion, I think they think they're fighting the good fight, and I think they're actually contributing to religious secular wars. I don't see the split between religious and secular to be exactly the way that most people see it. The person who's a serious interpreter of the Enlightenment, Jonathan Israel, who's written sort of 3 door-stopping books going into all of the people that nobody, including me, has ever read. He's a real scholar. Even he, who started out with a thesis that I very much disagreed with, essentially that if you were, he has a thesis there, there's radical and moderate enlightenment, and as far as he's concerned, the radical enlightenment are the good guys, and they're the people who are for democracy, and they were all militant atheists. And even he concedes that that's not true if you read further. Hume is a curious case. I think Hume's book, The Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, is one of the more brilliant products of human reason. It's certainly the best argument against most arguments for gods that I've ever read. So Hume is an interesting
argument against
the existence of God. I mean, particularly as far as any conception of God that involved any conception of providence. It's a brilliant book. The interesting thing is, now here's where I'm very unorthodox. Hume is an atheist, but he's also a Tory. I mean, he's radically anti-democratic, and he doesn't believe in reason. He says human reason is impotent. So I've actually argued that this puts Hume out of the Enlightenment altogether. It's a controversial claim. I think it's correct, and I don't know how many people want to go into that matter, but I think that it's a great mistake for Dawkins, Hitchens, et cetera, to identify themselves in that way. And if you want to read a really good book that I think is an answer to the person he calls Ditchkins, Terry Eagleton's book, Reason, Faith, and Revolution, is a good antidote, I think.
Okay, so you'll read that by next time Susan comes to Ghent. Okay, is there another question?
It's
yes?
short. It's short and beautifully written.
Before I pass on the microphone for the next question, following up on your book recommendation, what do you make of the book by Rebecca Goldstein, 36 Arguments for the Existence of God?
Haven't read it yet.
You should definitely do it. I recommend it. I recommend it.
Yeah? Okay. Yeah. I've read some other books of hers, but I haven't read that one yet.
36 Arguments for the Existence of God. Ah, okay. Okay. So you didn't find any of the 36 convincing then?
I think you're not supposed to.
Yeah, I understand. Okay. Yeah, but I mean, you never know. You may want to make fun of them, and some of them may still turn out to be convincing. So anyway, thank you for the reference.
Thank you.
So is there another question? And yes. Yes, if there is, we can do.
Yeah. So, following up on the former question, how is your view of the religion-secular divide then? Because when I read about America, I see that there's a lot of very progressive thinkers that are steeped in religious thought. I think of the Quakers, for instance, the Unitarians, for instance. That's a tradition that we in Europe don't really understand, and which I find fascinating. But in Europe, we're taught like, yes, well, religion, that's really silly and all that. But I was wondering, how do you see this then?
You know, it's interesting. It is common to say that America is deeply religious and Europe is not. Again, I can't speak to this situation. I can only speak to Germany, where I live. Americans would be appalled to know that there was religious instruction in all public schools. It's not allowed, which there is in Germany. That there's, you know, if you belong to a religious community, I mean, you can have your choice, but it's on your income tax, it's on your, you know, your personal registration, and even apart from sort of bureaucratic structures like that, the Bundestag, the German parliament, has a Bible study group with over 100 members of parliament participate in this. So it's...
Not only CSU,
no,
CDU
members. SPD. I know SPD people who are in it. So I don't know about it. There may be Greens in it too. I should find out. In any case, the person who told me about it is a is a member of the parliament, SPD, left-wing SPD, long history and all of that. So, so I would be careful about, you know, categorizing things like that, because there are ways in which there are religious structures in Europe. They just don't make so much noise about them, but they're in part in the fabric. I mean, if every single child who goes to a German public school has to take a religion course, that's a pretty serious... I mean, I would be in favor of there being a sort of history of religion course. I think everybody should know more about everybody's religion. But what you do in Germany is you click, you're either Catholic or you're Protestant. Occasionally now there's offerings for Jewish and Muslim students, or they get to opt out. But it's, that's pretty serious.
But the sharp contrast is in the trends. So when everywhere in every European country except for Poland, you have, in terms of any indicator of religious practice, religious belief, etc., you have a very sharp downward trend, which you don't observe in the United States.
No, you don't. Look, I think several things are going on in the States. I think religion very clearly fulfills functions that get served in other ways in Europe, even in very crass ways, okay? The churches provide a huge amount of social services that are not provided by the state in the US, but that are provided by the state in Europe. More importantly, I don't know if you've been to the States or not, but in very many places, the possibility of public space is, been eaten away all the time, just simply by the geography. I mean, by the fact that there's no public transportation in most places, or it's terrible. The ways in which things have been constructed feed a particular form of American capitalism. And to get over the kind of isolation that many people feel in that culture, they join churches. Now, I'm not saying, I don't want to be reductionist about it. I think there are other things that are going on too. But that's certainly one thing that's going on. I mean, on a deeper level, why don't I see the secular religious split as being as absolute as many people? I don't, because with the exception of people who are really fundamentalist, I don't think that our decisions are actually made on religious grounds. And I think many of our motives have nothing to do with whether we believe in the existence of God or not. By the way, to answer your question, I'm a good Kantian. I don't think this is a question we have any access to answering. But I deliberately wrote the book in a way that you could read it as if I were an atheist, or you could read it as if I were a believer, precisely because I wanted to be able to appeal to both. I wanted to be able to say, look, and I start and end with interpretation of pieces of the Bible, because perhaps this is my anti-Dawkins bias. I mean, he's a charming guy. I've been at a few conferences with him. I don't mean to say that I'm on a vendetta or something. But there's such richness in that tradition that secular people often tend to ignore in ways that I think contribute to a divide that shouldn't be. So I wanted to be able to say, look, there's a very rich tradition, but you don't have to read it in a fundamentalist way. You can read it in quite a different way. Yeah, I don't know if this answers your...
It's whether it does or not, we'll have to finish now. Yeah. It's 9 o'clock, so I want, on your behalf and on mine, and on the behalf of this building, to thank Susan very much for this talk. In fact, as you've heard from other people, this building has seen a long history of events, including parts of fights that were no doubt sometimes driven by sheer class interest, also probably by some opportunistic behavior on the part of some of the leaders, but to a significant extent by idealism. And I'm sure this building will be relieved to hear that it's possible to be a grown-up idealist, to keep fighting for a better world without being naive. Thank you very much to you.